Imagine dying, not once, not twice, but hundreds of times across 12,000 years of human history. Imagine waking in a body that is biologically your own, carrying the muscles of a master swordsman and the neural architecture of a trained killer, but holding none of the memories that made you who you were. Imagine the slow, creeping horror of realizing that somewhere beneath the engineered flesh and the conditioned neurons, there is a ghost of a man who has already lived and died more times than most civilizations have risen and fallen. That is the life of Duncan Idaho. And it is one of the most extraordinary, disturbing, and philosophically devastating arcs in all of science fiction. Today, we are going deep. We are pulling apart the forbidden science at the heart of the Dune universe, the biological nightmare of the Tleilaxu Axlotl tanks, the mechanical heresy of Ixian cybernetics, and the terrifying synthesis of both that gradually transforms one loyal swordmaster into something that defies every category humanity has ever invented for itself. We are mapping the agonizing cycle of Duncan Idaho's Rebirth, iteration by iteration, across Frank Herbert's 6 original novels and beyond. By the end, you will understand why Duncan Idaho is not simply the most resurrected character in science fiction. He is a mirror, held up to humanity's deepest fears about identity, memory, and what we are willing to sacrifice to survive. Let us begin at the beginning. The first thing you need to understand is what Duncan Idaho represents before the Tleilaxu ever get their hands on him. He is not a great lord. He is not a prophet. He is not born to the spice-rich deserts of Arrakis or the rarefied halls of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. He is a man of loyalty, a man of extraordinary physical and moral excellence who chose from the earliest years of his life to place that excellence entirely in service to House Atreides. He trained on Caladan under the eyes of Gurney Halleck and the Old Masters, becoming arguably the finest human swordsman alive, a man whose blade work was so precise and so intuitive that even mentats struggled to model it computationally. And then, on the desert planet Arrakis, during the night of betrayal that destroyed the Atreides household, Duncan Idaho made the choice that would define the next 12,000 years of human history. He stood his ground. He held the pass. He bought the lives of Paul Atreides and Lady Jessica with his own, fighting through wave after wave of Sardaukar until he could fight no more. His death in the first Dune novel takes up barely a paragraph, but the consequences of that death unfold across all of recorded human civilization. Now, to understand what happens next, we need to talk about the Bene Tleilax and their most jealously guarded achievement. The Tleilaxu are a secretive, deeply religious brotherhood of genetic masters operating from a cluster of worlds at the fringes of the known universe. For thousands of years, they are regarded by the other great powers of the Imperium with a mixture of awe and barely concealed disgust. They traffic in biological marvels, face dancers, who are shape-shifting agents capable of perfectly mimicking any person they study, twisted mentats, human computers engineered to particular specifications, and the technology they are most famous for, which is the creation of Gholas. A Ghola is the Tleilaxu term for a being grown from the recovered cells of a dead person. To the outside world, a Ghola looks exactly like the person it derives from. It carries the same genetic code, the same physical architecture, the same raw biological potential. But a Ghola is not a simple clone. It is something more complicated and far more horrifying than a copy. The foundation of the entire Ghola process is the Axlotl tank. For much of the Dune series, the Tleilaxu guard the nature of these tanks as their most sacred secret. To the outside universe, they are described in technical language as sophisticated biological growing chambers, advanced enough to reconstruct a complete human being from a small sample of cellular material. They are spoken of as machinery, as vats of engineered biochemistry, as the apex of Tleilaxu scientific achievement. But the truth, which Frank Herbert reveals with devastating understatement in Heretics of Dune, is something else entirely. The Axlotl tanks are women. Specifically, they are Tleilaxu women, the females of the Bene Tleilax, who have been surgically and neurologically altered beyond recognition. transformed into living incubators, their bodies converted into vast biological processing systems, their minds reduced to the barest flicker of autonomic function. They are kept in a permanent vegetative state. Their reproductive and metabolic systems are hijacked to serve as the biological substrate for Ghola production. Every single Ghola ever grown, every Duncan Idaho ever resurrected, every face dancer ever deployed as a spy and shapeshifter has been gestated inside the body of a woman who was once a person. This revelation reframes everything. The Tleilaxu present themselves to the universe as masters of sacred science, as religious ascetics following a path of divine genetic stewardship. Their entire public theology is built around the idea that they alone understand the deeper biological truths of creation. But their civilization is built on the hidden enslavement and biological consumption of their own women, a horror concealed beneath layers of theological language and technical mystification. It is, in the truest Herbertian sense, a picture of how power hides its crimes behind the vocabulary of the sacred. The cellular recovery process works like this. For the Axlotl tanks to produce a Ghola, the Tleilaxu need viable genetic material from the target individual. In the case of Duncan Idaho, they recover cells from his body after his death on Arrakis. Dead cells, retrieved and preserved within a specific window of viability, contain everything necessary to reconstruct the physical body of a person with near-perfect fidelity. The body that emerges from the tank is not a metaphor. It is genuinely, biologically, the same person in terms of genetic architecture, the same hands, the same eyes, the same neural pathways associated with a lifetime of extraordinary training. But reconstruction of the body is only the first problem. The far more complex challenge, and the one that will define Duncan Idaho's entire arc across the saga, is the question of memory. A standard Ghola, when first grown and awakened, is a blank slate in terms of experiential memory. It has the physical capabilities encoded in its genetic architecture, the muscle memory, the trained reflexes, the neural structures associated with mastered skills. The first Duncan Ghola, who was given the name Hayt and presented to Paul Atreides as a gift by the Tleilaxu in Dune Messiah, demonstrates this clearly. Hayt is a superlative fighter, a trained mentat, a being of extraordinary capability. He is, on a biological level, Duncan Idaho, but he does not remember being Duncan Idaho. He does not remember Caladan, or the training grounds, or the face of Leto I, or the sand of Arrakis, where he chose to die. The question of recovering those memories is the great psychological drama of the Ghola's existence. The Tleilaxu have discovered, through centuries of disturbing experimentation, that a Ghola's original memories are not simply erased. They are encoded at some deep level of cellular and neural structure, waiting. And they can be awakened, but the process requires trauma. The Ghola must be placed under conditions of extreme psychological or physical stress. The most reliable trigger appears to be a genuine threat to life, a moment so intense that the conscious conditioning of the Ghola cracks and the deeper substrate of original experience floods to the surface. In the case of Hayt, the trigger is the moment when his Tleilaxu programming commands him to kill Paul Atreides. The conflict between that command and the original Duncan Idaho's absolute loyalty to House Atreides creates a psychological crisis so severe that the real memories break through. He remembers. And in remembering, he becomes Duncan again, at least partially, at least in the ways that matter most. This process is not clean. It is not a matter of restoring a backup from a pristine archive. It is violent, disorienting, and incomplete. The recovered memories overlay, but do not erase the conditioned existence of the Ghola. Every Duncan Idaho who recovers his original self must then navigate a consciousness that contains at least two distinct experiential timelines running simultaneously: the life of Hayt, or whatever name the new Ghola was given, and the original memories of Duncan Idaho pressing through like water through cracked stone. That fracture, that doubled consciousness, is the seed of everything that makes Duncan Idaho so important to the larger story. Now, to understand the second great force shaping his evolution, we need to talk about the Ixians, and about the shadow that hangs over every moment of the Dune universe from its very beginning. 12,000 years before the events of the original Dune novel, humanity fought a war. The Butlerian Jihad, named in part for a woman named Johanna Butler, was a civilization-wide uprising against thinking machines, against artificial intelligence, against the vast networked computational systems that had, over centuries, come to govern nearly every aspect of human life, and, in doing so, stripped humanity of meaningful agency over its own existence. The jihad lasted generations. It ended with the near-total destruction of sophisticated artificial intelligence and the adoption of the most profound cultural prohibition in human history. Thou shalt not make a machine in the image of the human mind. This commandment shaped everything that followed. It created the mentats, human beings trained from childhood to perform the analytical functions that computers once handled. It elevated the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, whose mastery of human biology and consciousness became civilization's substitute for genetic engineering software. And it created the Spacing Guild, whose navigators used spice-altered perception to fold space and guide starships through paths no mechanical computer was permitted to calculate. But not everyone obeyed. Not entirely. Not always. The Ixians were the great equivocators of the known universe. Based on the planet Ix, originally a sophisticated industrial world, the Ixian technocrats pushed constantly against the boundaries of the Butlerian prohibition. They understood that the letter of the commandment concerned machines that think in the way humans think, machines that replicate the human mind's structure and process. And so they engineered systems that approached that threshold without, by their reckoning, crossing it. They built mechanical navigational devices that processed astronomical data without being conscious. They developed tracking systems and communication technologies of extraordinary sophistication. They walked the edge of the forbidden, generation after generation, always claiming that their machines merely assisted human decision-making rather than replacing it. The distinction, as many characters in the novels pointedly observe, was somewhat convenient. What the Ixians eventually develop, in secret, over centuries, is a way to encode and preserve not just genetic information, but experiential data. A system capable of storing the pattern of a human mind with enough fidelity that it can be loaded into a sufficiently prepared biological substrate. This is, by any honest assessment, exactly the kind of thinking machine technology the Butlerian Jihad was fought to prevent. It is the near digitization of consciousness. It is the creation of a backup of a human soul. And it is precisely what becomes integrated into the later iterations of the Duncan Idaho Ghola process. The synthesis of Tleilaxu biological engineering and Ixian data preservation creates something unprecedented. The Axlotl tanks provide the biological body grown to physical perfection and encoded with the genetic memory of Duncan Idaho's musculature and neural architecture. The Ixian systems provide something that goes beyond genetic memory, a structured recording of experience, personality, and decision-making patterns. The weight of accumulated living compressed into a transmissible form and delivered to a new biological host. This is the Ghola's evolution, from biological miracle to something genuinely post-human. And the tension it creates within Duncan himself, between the ancient flesh and blood identity of the original Swordmaster and the increasingly synthetic layers of enhancement and recorded history accumulating around that original core, becomes one of the great internal dramas of the later novels. Because what no one fully accounts for in all these extraordinary technical achievements is the question of what it costs to be the person inside that process. Frank Herbert never gives us a complete accounting of exactly how many Duncan Idaho Gholas Leto II creates and destroys during his 3,500-year reign as the God Emperor. The number is understood to be enormous, dozens at minimum, possibly hundreds. Each one grown, awakened, given the recovered memories of the original Duncan Idaho, set to work in service to the God Emperor's plan, and eventually killed, either by circumstance, by Leto himself, or by the machinations of those who plot against him. The sheer volume of that repetition deserves a moment of genuine contemplation. Every one of those deaths is experienced as real by the Duncan Idaho of that iteration. Every one of those lives contains years or decades of genuine experience, genuine relationships, genuine accumulated understanding, and every one ends, and then another begins, carrying forward not only the genetic memory of the original Duncan, but also, in the later formulations, fragments of the experiential data accumulated by previous Gholas. The early Ghola iterations, beginning with Hayt in Dune Messiah, are relatively close to the original Duncan Idaho in personality and psychology, at least after the memory recovery event. Hayt is calculating, observant, and possessed of the original Duncan's fundamental moral core. He is used by the Tleilaxu as a tool against Paul Atreides, a weapon designed to destabilize the Emperor of the known universe by exploiting his grief over Duncan's original death. That the weapon turns against its makers is a testament to the depth of the original Duncan's identity, the persistence of character across the biological reconstruction process. But as the Ghola cycle continues through Leto II's reign, the psychological profile of each successive Duncan becomes more complex. Each new iteration inherits not just the original memories, but a layered awareness that the memories themselves represent a history of deaths. Some iterations know they are Gholas from their first awakening. Others are raised in relative ignorance and experience the memory recovery as a catastrophic revelation. The psychological strategies each Duncan develops to cope with this knowledge differ, shaped by the conditions of their specific upbringing and their relationship with Leto. What Leto himself intends with the endless Duncan cycle is a matter of deep complexity in the novels. The God Emperor, who is simultaneously human and sandworm and prophet, possesses prescient vision extending thousands of years into the future. His golden path, the long plan designed to prevent human extinction through enforced stagnation and eventual explosive dispersal, requires specific human types to be preserved and tested. Duncan Idaho represents something specific in that calculus. The near-perfect warrior, yes, but more importantly, the man who cannot be fully predicted, the human variable who consistently surprises even Leto's prescience by acting from a depth of genuine feeling that defies computational modeling. Leto destroys each Duncan partly to test that unpredictability, and partly because an immortal ruler, isolated within the prison of his own divine certainty, requires a succession of human anchors to remind him of what humanity actually is. The psychological toll of this cycle on the Duncans, who understand their situation, is almost incalculable. Frank Herbert sketches it in spare, devastating terms. The knowledge that you are not the first to be you, that there was a Duncan before you and there will be a Duncan after you, that your specific experience of being alive will be ended and begun again by forces entirely outside your control, is a form of existential horror that no philosopher of the pre-Dune era adequately prepared anyone to face. The Duncans who thrive are those who manage to locate something essential in the present moment of being Duncan Idaho that does not depend on the chain of previous or future Duncans for its validity. The ones who cannot make that separation are consumed by it. And even those who thrive are fundamentally changed by the knowing. Each successive Duncan Idaho who emerges from Leto's service is a slightly different configuration of the original template, shaped by the specific contours of his particular life and death. By the time we reach the Duncan Idaho of Heretics of Dune, 12,000 years after the original Swordmaster fell on Arrakis, we are dealing with a being whose connection to that original man is real but highly mediated. A self built on layers of iteration, in the way that a coastline is built on layers of sediment, recognizably continuous, but transformed by every storm. And then the storms got worse. In Heretics of Dune, the universe that Paul and his children and Leto II shaped has fractured. Leto's golden path worked in its deepest intention. Humanity, in the 1500 years since the God Emperor's death, has dispersed across the stars in what is called the scattering, an explosion of colonization into previously uncharted regions of the galaxy. The old structures of the Imperium are fragmented. The spice monopoly is threatened. And returning from the scattering, warped and dangerous, are the honored mattress, female warriors whose power systems and sexual conditioning represent a dark mirror of the Bene Gesserit's own techniques, but stripped of their philosophical restraint and driven by a terror of something they encountered in the outer dark that the reader does not fully understand until the very end. Into this chaos comes the latest Duncan Idaho, Ghola, grown for the Bene Gesserit sisterhood by the Tleilaxu, in an arrangement saturated with competing agendas. This Duncan is different from his predecessors in ways that matter enormously. The Tleilaxu, working now in secret consultation with Ixian techniques they have absorbed and adapted, have loaded this Ghola with something unprecedented. Not just the genetic memory of the original Duncan Idaho, not just recovered experiential data from a handful of previous Ghola iterations, but a systematically compiled archive of everything significant that every previous Duncan Idaho experienced, compressed and encoded at the cellular level, waiting to unfold. This is the Super Ghola. When this Duncan's memories fully awaken, he does not merely recover the original Swordmaster. He recovers everything, the grief of Hayt. The philosophical conversations with Leto II across dozens of long iterations of service, the specific texture of dying in dozens of different ways, on dozens of different worlds, under dozens of different political circumstances, 12,000 years of lived experience carried in a body that is biologically still a young man. Ugh. The weight of that is not metaphorical. It is, within the logic of the Dune universe, a literal cognitive and psychological burden of almost unimaginable magnitude. And yet, the remarkable thing is that Duncan Idaho carries it. He integrates it. He becomes, through that integration, something that no individual human being was ever designed by evolution or training to be. But the most significant thing, encoded in this final Duncan, goes beyond experiential memory. The Ixian contribution to his construction includes something that sits at the absolute limit of what the Butlerian prohibition permits, or perhaps slightly beyond it. Within the neural architecture of this Duncan Idaho, there is a sensitivity deliberately engineered to the quantum-level distortions caused by prescient vision and by no-ships. A no-ship is an Ixian vessel equipped with technology that renders it invisible to prescient detection, to the guild navigators, to the Bene Gesserit's long sight. The honor matres use similar technology to devastating effect. And Duncan Idaho, uniquely among all living beings, can sense the presence of such a vessel through what can only be described as an intuitive perception that is neither quite human instinct nor quite mechanical detection. It is something engineered to occupy the space between those categories. This capacity makes him not merely a warrior or a political tool. It makes him potentially a weapon against the one technology that the old powers of the universe have no defense against. An enemy no one can see can only be found by a detector no enemy expects. And the Ixians, in their centuries of walking the boundary of the Butlerian prohibition, have arrived at the conclusion that the most sophisticated detector possible is not a machine. It is a human being, rebuilt, augmented, and pushed just far enough across the line of ordinary humanity that the line itself becomes a question rather than an answer. The philosophical implications of that engineering decision radiate outward in every direction. The Ixians have done precisely what the Butlerian Jihad was fought to prevent, not by building a thinking machine, but by building a thinking human who functions in specific and critical ways, like one. They have used the loophole of biological substrate to circumvent the spirit of the prohibition while honoring its letter. And in doing so, they've created something that the original framers of the commandment, those survivors of the Great War against artificial intelligence, would have recognized immediately as the thing they thought they had destroyed. The enemy was never really the machines. The enemy was the impulse to replace genuine human uncertainty with optimized, predictable function. And that impulse, it turns out, fits just as comfortably inside a human skull as inside any engineered chassis. By the closing pages of Chapter House Dune, Frank Herbert's final novel, and completed just before his death in 1986, Duncan Idaho has become something that the series could not have fully anticipated in its opening chapters. He's not simply the most resurrected character in the story. He is the story's thesis statement about what it means to be human in a universe that has repeatedly tried to reduce humanity to a function. The No ship that escapes at the end of Chapter House, carrying Duncan and a remnant of the Bene Gesserit and the Ghola children, and the last fragments of the old order into the absolute unknown, is a kind of arc. It carries biological diversity, human beings representing a range of genetic lineages cultivated by the Bene Gesserit over thousands of years. It carries institutional knowledge, Reverend Mothers with their internal libraries of other memories stretching back into prehistory. It carries the Ixian technology that powers the vessel itself, the mechanical heresy given practical and necessary form. And it carries Duncan Idaho, who is the synthesis of all these things in a single human body. He functions, in this final configuration, as a repository of lived human experience that is genuinely unique in the universe. Not the Bene Gesserit's other memory, which is genetic and ancestral and structured by the female line of transmission. Not the Guild Navigator's prescient vision, which is spice-dependent and future-oriented, and ultimately a form of paralysis as much as power. Duncan's archive is something different. It is the accumulated weight of a specific identity, repeatedly rebuilt and maintained across an impossible span of time. It is the assertion that personhood is not merely a biological fact, but a narrative act. A story that continues to insist on its own coherence even when the substrate keeps changing beneath it. And that insistence, it turns out, is the most subversive thing in the universe. Every great power in the Dune saga, from the God Emperor to the Bene Gesserit to the Honored Matras, has operated on a fundamental assumption that individual human beings are manageable, that they can be predicted, controlled, conditioned, or replaced. The entire apparatus of prescience, of genetic manipulation, of mentat training and Bene Gesserit conditioning is predicated on the belief that human behavior can be made legible, made tractable, made to serve a larger design. Duncan Idaho, across 12,000 years and an uncounted number of deaths and rebirths, represents the systematic refutation of that assumption. Leto II, who possessed the deepest prescient vision any human being ever achieved, found Duncan consistently unpredictable. The Bene Gesserit, who could read emotional states and biological markers with extraordinary precision, could not fully model his responses. The Tleilaxu themselves, who created him, discovered that the identity they encoded in their axolotl tanks kept generating outcomes they had not designed. Duncan Idaho, in every iteration, in every generation, managed to be more than what anyone intended him to be. This is not presented in the novels as a mystical accident. It is presented as a feature of genuine personhood. The qualities that make Duncan consistently surprising, his loyalty operating from genuine feeling rather than conditioned reflex, his sense of justice persisting across memory recoveries and personality reconstructions, his capacity for authentic connection rather than strategic alliance. These are precisely the qualities that no engineering process, however sophisticated, can reliably produce on demand. Because they emerge from the interaction between a particular identity and the specific, irreducible contingency of being alive. That is what the Ixians, for all their brilliance, built into him without fully understanding what they were building. They thought they were creating a detection instrument, an optimized hybrid of biological and mechanical function. What they actually created, in synthesis with the Tleilaxu's biological mastery and 12,000 years of accumulated dying and being reborn, was something much simpler and much harder to replicate. They created a man who knew, with the certainty of someone who has died hundreds of times and woken up anyway, that being human is not a fixed state. It is a practice. It is a commitment made over and over again, in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty, to the proposition that who you are matters more than what you were designed to be. The arc of Duncan Idaho's story, from loyal Swordmaster to Ghola to Super Ghola to something approaching a post-human consciousness piloting an arc into the absolute unknown, is the Dune Saga's most intimate argument against the forms of totalizing control that its villains and even many of its heroes attempt to impose on the universe. The Golden Path itself, Leto II's grand design for human survival, required the eventual production of a being who could transcend the Golden Path, the The road to genuine human freedom had to run through a valley of controlled suffering and artificial death and forbidden science. And the guide who would lead humanity out of that valley had to be someone who had experienced every horror of that road firsthand, who had died in it and been reborn in it so many times that nothing in it could frighten him any further. The forbidden science of the Axlotl tanks and the Ixian heresy converge, ultimately, not in a triumph of technology over humanity, but in a restoration of humanity through technology. Every transgression that went into building Duncan Idaho, every ethical violation of the Tleilaxu women locked in vegetative servitude, every boundary crossing of the Ixian technocrats, every brutal death and disorienting rebirth was, in Frank Herbert's design, the price of producing a human being fully capable of facing a genuinely open future without the crutch of prescience, without the armor of conditioning, without the certainty of a plan. The no ship disappears into the unknown, carrying Duncan Idaho and a small remnant of humanity into a galaxy where no one can predict what comes next. And that, in the logic of the Dune universe, is the first genuinely free moment in 12,000 years of recorded human history. The Tleilaxu built their tanks to cheat death. The Ixians built their machines to cheat uncertainty. Duncan Idaho, in the end, learned to live with both. Not to overcome them, not to engineer around them, but to carry them forward as the defining conditions of genuine existence. He is the bridge. Not only between biological purity and synthetic future, though he is that too. He is the bridge between who humanity was frightened and controlled and desperate to make the universe legible and safe, and who humanity might still choose to become. Free to move through a cosmos that does not already know how the story ends. And perhaps that is the real reason he keeps coming back. Not because the Tleilaxu grow him in their tanks, not because the Ixians encode his memories in their forbidden systems, but because a story like his, a story that insists on personhood in the face of everything designed to reduce a person to a function, is a story the universe keeps needing to hear.